road to World War II. Attempts at collective security in the 1920s and Great Depression. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany severely. It excluded most of Wilson's 14 points. The League of Nations sought collective security, but without support from the United States, USSR, and Germany, the League was crippled. The U.S. Senate refused to adhere to the World Court, the League of Nations judicial arm. The effectiveness of the League of Nations, what it did do was help to settle disputes between small powers, but it was a lot less successful when major powers were involved. The Washington Disarmament Conference, 1921 to 1922, sought to reduce the naval arms race between the U.S., Japan, and Britain, and to resolve disputes in the Pacific. The five-power treaty that came out of it created a 5-5-3 battleship ratio, with the United States and Britain having 5 battleships for every 3 Japanese battleships. There were also other agreements that were weak as they had no enforcement provisions. What the Washington Disarmament Conference did do was keep the open door in China preserved. The Locarno Pact, 1926, Western Europe agreed to guarantee the existing borders and seek peaceful solutions. Germany promoted peaceful settlement of disputes with its neighbors in Eastern Europe, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and many Europeans believed the spirit of Locarno would mean no more war in Europe. Probably the loftiest of all of these was the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. It was ratified by 62 nations, and it made war illegal except for defensive purposes. But if war is illegal, then why would you need to fight it in defensive purposes? Major flaws were there was no enforcement mechanism. The aggressors could use defensive purposes arguments when attacking. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact, while it sounded good on paper, was never actually going to work. War debts and reparations. The U.S. was the largest creditor nation after World War I. The Allies owed the U.S. about $16 billion. The Allies couldn't pay, so they depended on Germany's reparation payments in order to pay the U.S. But U.S. tariff policies hurt European recovery, and Germany's economy couldn't handle the pressure and basically collapsed in 1923. In steps the Dawes Plan in 1924. U.S. bankers loaned Germany money. Germany paid that money to the United Kingdom and France, who then paid it back to the U.S. U.S. credit would continue to help finance the issue until the crash of 1929. In 1931, Hoover had declared a debt moratorium, and before long, all debtors defaulted. U.S. policies harbored ill will among European nations towards the U.S., contributed to the neutrality legislation which was passed by Congress during the 1930s. The Great Depression would become a major cause of the totalitarianism in Japan and Germany. The stock market crash in the U.S. triggered a worldwide depression. Germany was ravaged by 50% unemployment and enormous inflation. The inflation was so bad that the Deutschmark was literally useless. Japanese exports fell by 50%, and they blamed the West for its protectionist trade policies or high tariffs. So Japan begins to attack the disarmament policy established in 1922, and military restlessness with Parliament and the economy. The Prime Minister of Japan was assassinated in 1930. American foreign policy in the early 1930s. The good neighbor policy. Pre-FDR policies began an improved relationship with Latin America. The U.S. troops were removed from several Latin American countries. The oil crisis in Mexico in 1928 was peacefully resolved. The Clark Memorandum in 1928 that said the U.S. would not intervene in Latin America for its own national purposes was well received by Latin American countries, though it wasn't true. And the policy was essentially a reaction to overseas aggression. We were trying to create a stable Western Hemisphere. The Montevideo Conference, or the Seventh Pan-American Conference of 1933, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, said that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. He recommended that tariffs be lowered. The U.S. withdrew from Nicaragua in 1933. In 1934, Marines withdrew from Haiti and stayed out of war-torn Cuba. For the first time since 1915, there were no troops in Latin America. We signed a treaty with Cuba repealing the Platt Amendment. In 1936, the Buenos Aires Convention, the U.S. agreed to admit all American disputes to arbitration. In 1938, the U.S. did not intervene in Mexico when they nationalized their oil fields. Also in 1938, the Declaration of Lima, where 21 states agreed to resist together any threat to peace in the hemisphere. Think of the Monroe Doctrine on steroids. In the Declaration of Panama in 1939, the U.S. eased policy towards Panama. The London Economic Conference. The London Economic Conference was attended by 66 nations in the summer of 1933. The purpose of the conference was to confront the global depression. The goals: stabilize national currencies and revive international trade. FDR would torpedo the conference as he did not want to return to a gold standard. It resulted in more international isolationism for the U.S. and extreme nationalism in the U.S. There was also a call for a reduction of tariffs under the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. So trade agreements that aimed at both relief and recovery were part of the good neighbor policy. Low tariffs would be implemented, including a reduction of Haley-Smoot. The significance: it reversed the high tariff policy that was in place since the Civil War that had damaged the U.S. international economies after World War I, and paved the way for a U.S.-led free trade international economic system after World War II. By 1939, Hull had successfully negotiated pacts with 21 countries regarding tariff rates. In 1933, FDR recognized the USSR. For the first time, the USSR was formally recognized as a country and would become one of our allies in World War II. In the Philippines, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. The islands were to become free after a 10-year period of economic and political tutelage. The Jones Act in 1916, which was supported by Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, had granted the Philippines territorial status and promised independence as soon as a stable government could be established. So, why give up the Philippines? Organized labor wanted low-wage Filipino labor to be excluded from the U.S. U.S. sugar growers and other producers were eager to restrict competition from the Philippines. And U.S. isolationists were eager to get rid of the political liability in the Far East. The U.S. economic terms towards the Philippines were harsh. Japan, encouraged by U.S. unwillingness to maintain its control in Far East possessions, began eyeing the Philippines. The failure of collective security and the rise of totalitarian regimes. Fascism glorified the state and sought to expand. In Italy, fascist leader Mussolini rose to power in 1922. In Japan, a military dictatorship was established in 1930. In Germany, Adolf Hitler legally rose to power with the Nazi Party. And communism became a ruthless dictatorship under Stalin in the USSR from 1924 to 1953. Japanese aggression. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in China. The League of Nations condemned the action, but there was no enforcement. Japan had violated the Nine Power Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Hoover-Stimson Doctrine. In the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, President Hoover refused to consider economic or political sanctions, but refused to recognize the Japanese conquest of Manchukuo, or Manchuria. Because the League of Nations questioned Japanese action, Japan simply withdrew from the League. No further enforcement of the Nine-Power Treaty or Kellogg-Briand Pact ever took place. Why was Japan being aggressive? Why were they expanding? The military leaders of Japan were trying to establish what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was needed because Japan required raw materials if they were going to further industrialize and expand their power. They badly needed things like coal, oil, and iron. They also wanted more space for their large population. They wanted to open new foreign markets because they were economically frustrated. They were also angry at the U.S. because they felt they were given unequal status in the 1921 naval treaties. And they were also angry over the Hoover-Stimson Treaty, or Hoover-Stimson Doctrine. 1934 signaled the end of the Washington Naval Treaty, and they started a massive naval buildup. In 1936, they signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany. So Japan signs a pact with Nazi Germany against communism, especially the USSR. Ideologically speaking, fascists and communists are mortal enemies. Fascism rests on the far right side of the political spectrum, while communism rests on the far left side. In 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, creating the Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo Axis, or the Axis powers. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia with bombers and tanks, and had won by 1936. Mussolini had sought to re-establish the glory of the Roman Empire. The League of Nations hit Italy with economic sanctions on everything except for oil. In July, the League lifted the sanctions, and this is really seen as the end of the League of Nations. They had failed to do anything when Japan became aggressive and began its expansionist policies, and now they had failed to stop Italy from taking territory by force in Africa. American isolationism in the face of fascist aggression. Americans were concerned with their own economic depression. They sought to avoid involvement in Europe in the face of rising dictatorships, and were not immediately alarmed at the totalitarianism in Europe. American sentiment cried for constitutional amendment to forbid a declaration of war by Congress, except in case of an invasion, unless there was first a favorable public referendum. That constitutional amendment will never come into fruition. The WWII Committee was established. Many believed that World War I was needless, and the U.S. entered so that munitions makers could profit. The WWII Committee was established to investigate that charge. Munitions manufacturers were dubbed merchants of death. The committee charged bankers had wanted the war to protect loans, arms makers, and to make money, and that Wilson had provoked Germany by sailing into the warring nation's waters. Today, most believe that the committee was flawed and excessively anti-business. But their findings resulted in the Neutrality Acts that existed between 1935 and 1937. When the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically go into effect under these Neutrality Acts. They prohibited the sale of arms to belligerent nations. They prohibited loans and credits to belligerent nations. Both of those things they believed had driven us into war in World War I. They also forbade Americans to travel on vessels of nations at war, in contrast to World War I. So never again would they have something like the Lusitania. Non-military groups or non-military goods must be purchased on a cash and carry basis, or pay when the goods are picked up. It also banned involvement in the Spanish Civil War that was taking place in Europe. In effect, these Neutrality Acts limited the options of the president in a crisis. America declined to build up its armed forces. The Navy declined in relative strength. We did not want to burden the taxpayers during a depression. The Spanish Civil War, 1936. A nationalist group in Spain, led by Francisco Franco, fought the Democratic Republican government, or the Loyalists as they called them. They wanted to restore the power of the church and destroy socialism and communism in Spain. They called for a fascist state. Congress, encouraged by FDR, amended the neutrality legislation to apply to an arms embargo to both Republican loyalists and fascist rebels. We were going to stay out of it on both sides. International implications of that decision: the democracies of the world stood by as the loyalist democracy in Spain was killed by fascist aggressors. Both Mussolini and Hitler watched Spain and used it as a testing ground for future aggression. The Rome-Berlin axis helped the nationalists win in Spain, and Franco imposed fascism in Spain. Italy signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany in 1937, and the weakness of democratic countries encouraged Hitler and Mussolini in Europe. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale attack on southern China. They invaded from northeastern China and moved south and west. They established a new order in Asia, in which Japan had commercial supremacy in China. It was the end of the open door. They further expanded into French Indochina, or Vietnam, and the Dutch East Indies. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, headed the Chinese resistance to Japanese militarism in China. The Panay Incident. December 12th of 1937, the Japanese bombed and sank a U.S. gunboat, the Panay, and 3 Standard Oil tankers on the Yangtze River. Roosevelt reacted angrily. He planned to seize U.S.-held property in China, but Japan apologized, paid the U.S. an indemnity, and promised no further attacks. American public called for withdrawal of all American forces in China. We wanted to stay out of it. In 1937, Roosevelt delivered his quarantine speech. He condemned Japan and Italy for their aggressive actions. He called on democracies to quarantine the aggressors by economic embargoes. It was criticized by isolationists who feared that FDR's posture might lead the U.S. into war. Because of that criticism, FDR retreated and sought less direct means to address the totalitarianism arising in Europe and Japan. German aggression. Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. In 1937, he withdrew from clauses of the Treaty of Versailles that pertained to Germany. In 1938, Germany absorbed Austria through Anschluss. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, adopted a policy of appeasement towards Germany. It does not want another world war. The British were still haunted by World War I, and so they appease Hitler and Germany and allow Hitler to continue to take small pieces, trying to avoid war. He rejected joining an alliance with France and Russia, claiming it would destroy the possibility of future negotiations. So he continues this policy of appeasement, as does the rest of Europe, making concessions to the aggressor, to Germany, in order to preserve peace. The pacifism of this appeasement policy was widespread in Britain and France, as memories of World War I were still deep. The U.S. also practiced appeasement through our policy of isolationism, the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. In 1939, Germany would take Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, which was a German-speaking province in Czechoslovakia. At the Munich Conference in September of 1938, he gets it. In March of 1939, he invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. After he had taken Czechoslovakia, he's warned that if he continues, it'll mean war. So the invasion of Poland will start World War II in Europe. 1 week after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler demanded the return of Danzig on the Baltic coast and the Polish corridor. Neville Chamberlain said the British would aid Poland if they were attacked. France followed suit. And then, to the surprise of the world, Germany and the USSR signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, on August 23, 1939. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was an agreement between Germany and the USSR that they would not go to war. These are groups, two countries, that are ideologically on opposite ends of the spectrum and should be enemies. But Stalin had his eyes set on parts of Poland. September 1st, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. Part of the secret end of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was that when Germany invaded Poland, they would give part of Poland to the Soviet Union. 2 days later, September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II begins. September 5th, 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt officially proclaims U.S. neutrality. The Axis powers and the Axis offensive in Europe and elsewhere. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939, they used a new type of warfare, the German Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Poland was unable to successfully defend itself. It surrendered September 27, 1939. The Soviet Union began to expand in the east. The USSR invaded Poland from the east about a month after Germany. Stalin also annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940. In November of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Winter War and won it by March of 1940. The Neutrality Act of 1939 was passed in response to the German invasion of Poland. Britain and France desperately needed U.S. airplanes and other weapons. But on September 5, 1939, FDR officially proclaimed U.S. neutrality. On September 21st, FDR is able to persuade Congress in special session to allow the U.S. to aid European democracies in a limited fashion. So the provisions of the Neutrality Act of 1939. The sale of weapons to European democracies would be on a cash and carry basis. In other words, no loans, no deliveries. European powers would have to pay in full, and they would have to pick up and move the goods by themselves. FDR was authorized to proclaim danger zones, which U.S. ships and citizens could not enter, in contrast to Wilson's World War I policy. The results: democracies benefited as they controlled the Atlantic. The U.S. economy improved as European demand for war goods helped bring the country out of the recession of 1937 and 38. German expansion in Western Europe. April 1940, they conquered Denmark and Norway. Also in April of 1940, FDR declared that Greenland, a possession of conquered Denmark, was covered by the Monroe Doctrine. May of 1940, Germany takes the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. June of 1940, France falls to Nazi Germany. German troops occupied 2/3 of France and took control of its government. In Vichy, France, a puppet government was established with the capital city of Vichy. With all of Western Europe conquered, Hitler began to look towards Britain. Hitler's demands to Britain: that they return all of Germany's colonies, that they agree to Germany's domination of continental Europe. Britain categorically refuses. And so Hitler orders German bombers, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to attack Britain, which would be defended by the British Royal Air Force, or the RAF. The Battle of Britain, fought between the German Luftwaffe and the British Royal Air Force, was largely an air battle that took place over Great Britain. The Germans bombed London beginning in September. The results of the Battle of Britain, the RAF eventually defeated the Luftwaffe. The plans were cancelled for a German invasion of Britain, or at least postponed, and as a result of the British victory in the Battle of Britain, British morale increased, and Winston Churchill became an inspirational leader of the country. The Tripartite Pact, September 1940. Japan was added to the Rome-Berlin Axis for mutual defense and military support. U.S. policy towards Japan increasingly grew confrontational. Germany and Italy expanded into the Balkans and North Africa, Greece, Yugoslavia, Egypt. Then Hitler made probably his biggest mistake, the same mistake that Napoleon had made. He invades the Soviet Union. He breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and in June of 1941 invades the Soviet Union. Part of what Adolf Hitler said the German people needed was Lebensraum, or living space, for the new German Empire, and so it had to be extended into Eastern Europe. Germany's advance in the USSR was halted on the outskirts of Moscow in late 1941, and winter set in, with German troops unprepared for the harshness of the Soviet winter. The siege on Leningrad would last for 2 years. The U.S. eventually sent $11 billion of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets in their aid to fight Nazi Germany in the Soviet Union. The Russian invasion was Hitler's fatal error. He opened a second front before Britain was subdued. The U.S. response to the war in Europe. On December 29, 1939, FDR delivered his Arsenal of Democracy speech during a fireside chat. He said that the U.S. could not remain neutral, since its independence had never before been in such danger. He claimed that the Nazi war aim was world domination. Many people feel that this speech marked the entrance of the U.S. into the war. The U.S. response to the fall of France and the Battle of Britain. FDR called on America to build a huge air force and a two-ocean navy, and Congress appropriated $37 billion to do so. In September of 1940, Congress passed the Selective Service and Training Act, the draft. At the Havana Conference in 1940, the U.S. agreed to share with 20 Latin American republics the responsibility of upholding the Monroe Doctrine. For the first time, the Monroe Doctrine was multilateral. Internationalism, a committee to defend America by aiding the Allies, was the most potent of the pro-intervention movement. They claimed the U.S. could not let Axis powers dominate the world. They urged direct aid to Britain. They appealed to isolationists for all methods short of war to defeat Hitler. Roosevelt had a strong internationalist sympathy, but he had to temper them publicly for fear of the political damage it would do, with most of the country still wanting to remain isolationist. The strongest of those isolationists were the America First Committee, headed by Senator Robert Taft. He argued that the fortress of America could be defended. We wanted defense and not intervention. On September 2nd of 1940, the Destroyer for Bases deal is established. FDR agrees to transfer to Britain 50 World War I class destroyers. In return, Britain promises the U.S. 8 valuable defensive base sites from Newfoundland to South America. The agreement was achieved by simple presidential agreement. In the election of 1940, the Republicans would nominate Wendell Willkie. He condemned FDR's alleged dictatorship and deficit spending of the New Deal. And like FDR, he promised to stay out of the war and strengthen U.S. defenses. The Democrats, breaking a tradition in place since George Washington, nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt for a third term. Roosevelt vowed to keep the U.S. out of the war. He vigorously defended the New Deal and U.S. aid to the Allies. Result of the election, FDR defeated Wilkie 449 to 82. It was closer than 1932 and 1936, but the Democrats would maintain their majority in Congress. January 6, 1941, Roosevelt delivers his Four Freedoms speech to Congress. Now that he had been elected, FDR didn't have to worry as much about the critics. So FDR asked Congress to increase the authority to help Britain, to protect the four freedoms: the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of religion, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Congress' response to that Four Freedoms speech was the Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease was put into place in April of 1941. It increases U.S. involvement in the European War. It's considered one of the most momentous laws ever passed by Congress. The provisions? It authorizes the president to give military supplies to any nation he deemed vital to the defense of the United States. And the accounts would be settled after the war. In other words, the European powers didn't have to pay now, they could pay when the war was over. There were critics. Isolationists and anti-Roosevelt Republicans saw it as the blank check bill. Some saw it as getting the U.S. even closer to involvement in the war. But the results, it effectively ended U.S. neutrality, and Germany and other Axis powers saw it as an economic declaration of war. U.S. war production immediately increased. Hitler began sinking U.S. ships on a limited scale with German subs. By the war's end, the U.S. would send $50 billion worth of arms and equipment to the nations fighting the aggressors, especially Britain and the USSR. The Atlantic Conference and the Atlantic Charter, August of 1941. A secret meeting between FDR and Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was held on a U.S. warship off the coast of Newfoundland. This was the first of a series of conferences between the two leaders. It was held in response to Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. At the Atlantic Conference, the Atlantic Charter was signed. It was formally accepted by FDR and Churchill and endorsed by Stalin later that year. It said that no territorial changes, contrary to the wishes of the inhabitants, would take place. In other words, self-determination. That governments abolished by the dictators would be regained. It called for a permanent system of general security, something bigger and better than the League of Nations. Reaction to the Atlantic Charter: liberals applauded the charter, as they had Wilson's 14 points. Isolationists condemned the charter for ending U.S. neutrality, for conferring with belligerent Britain on common policies. Escalating tensions with Japan. The U.S. refused to recognize Manchukuo, or Manchuria, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Japan outlined the proposed Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the Japanese empire of undefined boundaries in East Asia and the Western Pacific. They declared the open door policy ended and forced out American and other business interests from occupied China. In 1940, Congress passes an embargo. Following the fall of France, new militant Japanese government got the right from Vichy France to build air bases and to station troops in northern French Indochina, or what becomes Vietnam. The U.S. placed the embargo on the export of aviation gasoline, lubricants, scrap iron, and steel to Japan, and granted an additional loan to China. In December, they extended that embargo to include iron ore and pig iron, some chemicals, machine tools, and other products. In response, in September of 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, or the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis. Early in 1941, FDR moved the American Pacific Fleet from the West Coast to Pearl Harbor to demonstrate military readiness. The embargo of 1941. In July, Japan gained new concessions from Vichy France by obtaining military control of southern Indochina. So the U.S. froze Japanese assets in the U.S. They closed the Panama Canal to Japan, and they activated the Philippine militia and placed an embargo on the export of oil and other vital products to Japan. In Japanese-U.S. negotiations, offered a withdrawal from southern Indochina if the U.S. would resume economic relations. The U.S. demanded that Japan withdraw from Indochina and from China, and promised not to attack any other area in the Western Pacific, and to withdraw from the Tripartite Pact. No agreement was reached between the U.S. and Japan. The negotiations were really an attempt by the U.S. to buy time, to fortify the Philippines, and to build the two-ocean navy that had been authorized by Congress in 1940. The final negotiations in October of 1941, Hideki Tojo, an outspoken expansionist, becomes the Prime Minister of Japan. The Japanese secretly decided that if no agreement was reached by November 25th, that Japan would attack the U.S. They made unsuccessful negotiations with the U.S. on December 1st. They felt a war with the U.S. was inevitable. The Japanese war plan was to take the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines to gain oil, metals, and other raw materials. They believed that the attack on Pearl Harbor would destroy the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet and keep it from interfering with its plans. If they were able to destroy the Pacific Fleet, Japan believed that it would be able to take its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere before the U.S. could rebuild. The U.S. experts were able to crack the top-secret code of the Japanese, but they were only able to crack diplomatic codes. Through the cracking of diplomatic codes, we knew that Japan was going to attack. We just didn't know where, and most experts agreed that that attack would take place in the Philippines. Between December 1st and December 6th, we expected an attack. The U.S. thought that Japan would avoid a direct attack on the U.S. to avoid provocation. Then, December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. on a Sunday, they attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese sank or badly damaged all 8 battleships inside the harbor, including the Oklahoma and the Arizona. They damaged 10 other ships and destroyed 188 planes. Over 2,500 Americans were killed, 1,100 were wounded. 3 aircraft carriers escaped destruction. Those 3 aircraft carriers were out at sea on maneuvers. The Japanese losses were much smaller. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan on December 8th. He said that December 7th would be a date that will live in infamy. Congress quickly complied with only 1 dissenting vote. The same 1 dissenting vote had also voted against U.S. entry into World War I. Her first vote was the vote against entry into World War I. Last vote was a vote against entry into World War II. Germany and Italy, as part of the alliance system, responded by declaring war on the U.S. 3 days later. This was Hitler's third fatal blunder. Germany didn't have to declare war on the U.S. FDR and Churchill then agreed to defeat Germany first. Our war plan would be to focus on Hitler and Germany because we saw them as the greatest threat to world peace, rather than the U.S. concentrating on Japan. The U.S. increased troops from 2 to 12 million by 1946 and entered World War II.